Okay, so for the next couple topics at least, we're going to switch from talking about theories of crime to talking about specific forms of crime, sometimes with an eye towards trying to explain them, sometimes more with an eye towards kind of how we think about them and how the media portrays them. So we're going to start out with violent crime. And so this slideshow is about what we know about the various major violent crimes um, and kind of how we think about them. So, more specifically, we're going to talk about how much violence there is in the U.S. And so part of this should be a rehash from when we talked about crime trends at the start of the course. We'll talk about how the U.S. compares to other countries, and we're going to talk about the sort of UCR Part 1 violence, which is homicide, robbery, rape, and assault. So we'll talk about those in a bit more detail. In terms of what we know, again, this is review from earlier in the course. We have information, and for homicide, it's really our big one is Uniform Crime Report, which again is police data. But it also, aside from homicide, includes robbery and aggravated assault. There's also data from the NCVS that we'll talk about for assault, robbery, and sexual assault. And then there's other data for kind of more specific offenses. So especially for school, we have something called the School Safety Report, which we'll get to. So again, overall, we talked about this a few times already. The major kind of big story in terms of the trend for violence has been a pretty dramatic decline since the early 1990s. And so this chart shows you the NCVS trends for property victimization and violent victimization. So you see here that in terms of percent decrease, we have sort of bottomed out, and it's jogged up and down a bit. But gotta be careful when newspapers or reporters see something like this. They start talking about, oh my God, crime's gone up, which is technically true. It went up right here, but in terms of big picture, this is just sort of a little bump. So again, big story is pretty huge declines in violence since the 1990s. Again, you see the same thing in homicide. This is a lot longer trend though, because the NCVS only starts in here. And so you see this big decline since the early 1990s in homicides. We're sort of out here. We're still sort of bottomed out between 4 and 5. And again, these are per 100,000. So right now we're at right around 5 homicides per 100,000 people. So UCR data, what do we know about the major forms of violence? These are all the sort of Part 1 data. Again, I should probably update this, but they haven't changed a bunch since 2011. There's roughly 14, 15,000 homicides in a given year. That equates right now to a homicide rate of about 4.7 per 100,000. And one of the points of this is that on the top is the United States, on the bottom is Minnesota. And so we talk about national trends. That one of the things to keep in mind is that varies a lot by state. And so you see Minnesota is quite a bit safer in terms of homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault. We discussed the sort of rape numbers earlier in the semester, and my strong suspicion, although I've never sort of fully investigated this, is that Minnesota is a bit higher because it's such a progressive state when it comes to response to domestic violence, sexual assault, and rape, that I suspect what's going on is that a lot more rapes get reported. I would be pretty shocked if, in fact, the incidence of rape is higher in Minnesota than other states. Again, something we talked about before, but one of the issues is despite the fact that the big story has been a dramatic drop in violent crime, Americans' perception of violent crime tends not to sort of go with what actually is happening. And so you see the top line is every year they ask American citizens in a Gallup poll, do you think violent crime has gotten worse or not? And so people tend to think it's getting worse, it's getting worse, it's getting worse pretty much every year, whereas in fact it's the actual violent victimization rate has dropped during the same period. So for those again that at the start of class thought that things were bad and or getting worse, that you're not alone. That most Americans think that. Um, so in terms of the crime and violence decline, again, we talked about that. How do we explain it? We talked about theories, and we'll hit them again at the end of this section. But the other issue is why do most people think crime is getting worse, especially violent crime? Um, and we talked about this largely. It's a matter of media exposure and the fact that the media kind of hits on homicides, especially, and especially stranger homicides or very gruesome homicides, kind of over and over and over again. That gives the perception that things are getting a lot worse. So one of the stats is that during that big decline in homicides, where homicides went down like 40-50%, coverage of homicides during that same period went up about 400%. And largely it's because of the dominance of the cable news programs, the 24-hour news that are always sort of fishing for something to report. All right, so we'll talk a bit, starting with homicide, about specific kinds of crimes. So homicide, by definition, is taking somebody else's life. And note that not all homicides are criminal homicides. So, for example, if you're defending your own life, you have the right to kill somebody else to save your life or somebody else's life. So that would be an example of justifiable homicide. In terms of criminal homicide, usually we rank them in first degree, second degree, and then first and second degree murder, and then voluntary and involuntary manslaughter. So in terms of the difference between first degree and second degree murder, both are intentional, meaning that you intended to kill somebody. The difference between first and second is that in first degree, the murder was planned. So you thought about it, and you sort of made a plan to kill somebody, and you thought about it ahead of time, and then you followed through. So if you decided to kill your spouse and get the insurance money, and there's evidence that you planned ahead of time, that you kind of thought about what you were doing and you knew you were going to do it, that's an example of first degree murder. Second degree murder is that, yeah, you intended to kill somebody, but you did it sort of spur of the moment or split second, without malice aforethought, if you want to use the technical language. So an example of second degree murder would be somebody who comes home and finds their significant other engaged sexually with somebody else and sort of loses it and lashes out and kills their partner or the person their partner is with. So you did intend to kill them, but you didn't think ahead of time. You just sort of responded to what was there and you sort of snapped. So that's first and second degree murder. Manslaughter then is when you don't necessarily intend to kill somebody. So you get in a fight and you throw a punch and the person falls down and ends up hitting their head on the concrete and dying. That would be an example of voluntary manslaughter. Involuntary manslaughter, best example is you drink and get in the car and you drive and you kill somebody. So you didn't actually intend to even hit the person. You didn't intend to cause any harm. But a reasonable person should have known that if you drink and get in the car, you have a chance of killing somebody. So that's the difference between first and second, and between second and any murder and manslaughter. So it has to do with whether it was planned, that's first or second, or whether you intended to actually kill somebody, which is the difference between murder and manslaughter. In terms of what we know about most homicides, almost all homicides are perpetrated by males, 90%, and the vast majority of victims are also male. So homicides tend to be males killing other males. Almost all homicides are within race. That means black people tend to shoot black people, white people tend to shoot white people. And again, the vast majority are classified as non-stranger, which means an acquaintance or better. So it's people that know each other that are killing each other. As we talked about in social disorganization theory and other areas, African Americans are disproportionately likely to show up both as victims and perpetrators. And the actual numbers sort of vary year to year. and I hate to do it off the top of my head, but I think it's something like 40% or more, maybe 50% of homicides are perpetrated by African Americans. And if you think about the representation of the country, I think it's 13 to 15% of Americans are African American. Um, what do we know about the circumstances? By far, the most common circumstance for a homicide is an argument. Um, that is, you think about people at home, domestic violence incidents, two sort of friends or acquaintances arguing over something, a little bit of alcohol, a little bit of drugs, a firearm present, and that's the sort of recipe for the vast majority of homicides. 68% of homicides are caused by firearms, and most of those firearms are handguns. Um, let's see. One of the big issues with homicides, and we talked about this with social disorganization and a couple other theories, um, there are big differences in neighborhood levels. Homicide especially really tends to cluster in certain neighborhoods. And so you think about the neighborhoods where there's low levels of collective efficacy, high levels of social disorganization, and so on and so forth. That's where you get the bulk of homicides in our country. Um, when you compare the United States to other countries, homicide is the one crime that really makes us stick out. And so we've done NCDS-like surveys for countries like Great Britain and Canada and Australia. So you look at, are Americans more likely to beat each other up and get in fights and engage in rape or sexual assault and all these other crimes? And what we find out is that America tends to be sort of middle of the pack to sort of on the lower end of the use of non-lethal violence. Uh, on the other hand, with respect to firearms, we're 5 to 10 times more likely to kill each other. And even if you leave firearms out of the equation, we're still 2 to 3 times more likely to kill each other by methods other than firearms. And so one of the really sort of interesting questions in criminology is why is that true? Why is that the case? As an aside, when we do surveys like this, when we ask about property crime, U.S. tends to be on the low end of the spectrum in terms of property crime. So how likely are you to get your house burgled or to get your car window smashed and your property taken? Property crime tends to be more prevalent in other countries. So one of the sort of misconceptions is that crime is abnormally high in the U.S. And the kernel of truth is that murder is exceptionally high in the U.S. compared to other countries. So here's an example. Here are sort of our usual comparisons. So you look at Canada, Japan, Germany, France. These are, again, homicides per 100,000 people. And this is old data, but it's one of the last WHO studies that could be found, World Health Organizations. So ours is still up here higher than, ours right now is like 4.8. This is when it was sort of coming down in 2004 at 5.9. But it puts us in the ballpark of countries like Chile and Cuba and Kenya, as opposed to sort of other countries that are industrialized and more like us, Canada, Japan. Um, so, on the other hand, I also wanted to point out that there are countries for which homicide rates are exceptionally high that make all these countries look a lot better. So if you think about Rwanda, El Salvador, Colombia, there are exceptionally high homicide rates. So again, big question. Why does the U.S. have such high homicide rates? And three of the big theories that are put forth that have to do with firearms, economic inequality, and sort of our historical legacy. It is true that the U.S. has exceptionally high gun ownership rates, and especially handgun ownership rates. Um, our sort of general social survey finds that roughly 30% of households have a handgun. In other countries, that number ranges from 1 to 14%. So we are at least 2 times, and for most countries, 5, 6 times more likely to have handguns in the house. And that's just sort of one measure of how much firearms are available in the country. So on the one hand, and again, this is something we talked about in the last slide, is the last couple slides, is that the difference between U.S. and other countries is most evident in our homicide via firearm. So we are, depending on the year, depending on the country, anywhere from 5 to 10 times more likely to kill each other with firearms. And so logically, um, part of the issue has to be firearms and firearm availability and American use of firearms. On the other hand, the kind of counterpoint to that is we are still more likely aside from firearms. So part of the other picture, it has to be, it's very likely due to firearms. But on the other hand, there's also something more besides firearms. Um, so, every time there's a big shooting, most recently Orlando, you think about Aurora, Sandy Hook, and so on and so forth, we tend to have an issue about gun control and legislation, and people want to know, and the NRA sort of pro-gun side tends to say, well, there's no evidence that they work. And there's a kernel of truth to that there's not a lot of evidence in the U.S. that gun control has had an impact on homicides especially. Um, but there's sort of, it's more complex than that. One of the issues is that in the U.S., our gun regulations have never been exceptionally strong. We've done mandatory waiting periods and background checks. Um, but given the level of firearm ownership and the number of guns that are around, um, it's unlikely that that sort of regulation is going to have a huge impact. Um, the secondary gun market, people selling guns to each other, is largely unregulated. Even if there is laws, people purchase illegally. That's sort of straw man purchases. As long as you know somebody that has a clean record, you can have them legally buy a gun and then give it to you. And a lot of firearms are stolen in burglaries or borrowed from other people. And so one of the issues in the U.S. is there's so many guns around that even if we kind of crack down and had really strict gun laws, it would take a long time to sort of catch up with the slack that's already in the system. So this is something that's still being kind of continually studied. There is some evidence that gun control does have an impact on suicide. And so the idea is that if people are a lot more successful if they use guns as a suicide method. And so in those states where guns are more heavily regulated, it does seem to have an impact on suicide rates. The other sort of thing that people talk about is our sort of violent American history. Um, the Canadians and their dispute with England and their sort of knifing off from England was much more sort of peaceable. Though they're still tied in a lot of ways, whereas as the U.S. had an armed, bloody revolution to kind of knife ourselves off. You think of the Civil War, you think of our system of slavery and the treatment of Native Americans in this country. Um, People talk about this sort of legacy of violence and cowboy mentality. On the other hand, there's a lot of other nations that have as bad or worse histories than we do. If you think about Germany and atrocities during World War II, if you think of Japan um, and some of their cultural legacy, they now have amongst the lowest homicide rates in the world. And so that casts some doubt onto this idea that it's the cultural tradition that matters the most. Finally, one of the theories is that, and it's true if you look at city level data and country level data, that where you see the most economic inequality, so the very wealthy living amongst the very, very poor, you tend to see higher homicide rates. And so one of the issues is that the United States is sort of exceptional in those two things, that we tend to have a lot of economic inequality and we tend to have very high homicide rates compared to everybody else. And so you have theories about, which we talked about institutional enemy theory, Curie's market society theory, which is in the book. I don't remember if we talked about it in detail. But the idea is that sort of inequality breeds hostility and anger and other issues which create homicide. The primary criticism of that is, well, why would it affect homicide but not, robbery or aggravated assault or other forms of violence? And that's problematic because the U.S. is similar to Canada and Great Britain and Australia and in terms of other forms of violence. So this issue of kind of American exceptionalism and homicide is still sort of an open question. I think the consensus is that a good chunk of it has to do with firearm availability, but there's also a sort of another component that we're unsure of right now. A related area is and this is important for a couple of reasons. One, I think it helps explain why Americans think crime is getting worse and violence is getting worse when in fact it's not, and it's gotten better, is that there has been a spate of very public mass shootings that have drawn an enormous amount of coverage. And so it can be true that homicide's gone down, but if you have these very horrible mass shootings, that raises the level of anxiety. And so one of the things criminologists and others have sort of turned their focus to now is mass shootings. And one of the issues becomes that, how do you define it? Obviously, if you see Sandy Hook or you see the Aurora, you go, that's it. But if you're going to count that, then you have to have a definition. So what counts? Does a gang shootout where 3 people die count? You get this sort of morbid exercise in defining what counts and what doesn't. The Congress in 2013 created this, essentially made up a definition as a starting place, and that was that it had to occur in a public place and it had to result in 4 or more deaths. And that sort of gives you a starting point, because then you can go back and count and say, well, how many of these things happen and when have they happened? Are they getting worse? Are they getting better? And the starting point was that since 1983, 30 years, we've had 78 public mass shootings in the United States, which resulted in 547 deaths and over 1,000 casualties. So sort of 2 ways of looking at it is, one is that's a lot of public mass shootings. The other is to keep in mind that in any given year, 13 to 20,000 people die of homicide. And so you're talking about 30 years of data. Every 10 years is going to be, 150,000 deaths, right? 15,000 a year for 10 years. And so these shootings sort of make up a very, very, very small portion of the homicides that occur in the U.S. But with some good reason, they sort of, they draw a lot of attention. And they cause a lot of concern amongst Americans. A more recent analysis of public shootings kind of asks the question, well, how does the U.S. compare to the rest of the world with respect to these things instead of just homicide? And like homicide, America tends to really, really stick out. And so the U.S. had 90 events between 66 and 2012, and no country even came close to that figure. The Philippines was the runner-up at 18, and you see countries like France and Yemen and Russia with very, 10, 11, 12. Sadly, we've had, Orlando being the one that leaps into mind, San Bernardino. We've had more since then. And so as with homicide, people are trying to figure out kind of why the U.S. and why are those so exceptionally high. And so there's an article in Moodle about that. There's another article, a really interesting sort of analysis by Malcolm Gladwell, who's a famous sort of pointy-head statistician, thinking about why this is the case and how one sort of school shooting or public mass shooting might sort of lead to another. The analogy he uses over and over again is like a riot, that normally people standing around aren't going to loot a building or smash a window, but they can get sort of caught up in the madness for that little period of time when they're witnessing other people. And he uses that sort of analogy to talk about school shootings and how you might have some disgruntled person somewhere who, in a different context, wouldn't go on a shooting rampage, but in the context where other people have done it, it makes it more sort of reasonable and feasible. So it's a good read, interesting read, interesting sort of topic to talk about. Related to public mass shootings is school shootings we've had. Again, the Columbine, the Sandy Hook, and there's been several other. And that has led Congress and other bodies to say, well, how safe are schools? It's a fair question, and so we now every year have this indicators of school crime and safety that draw from NCBS data, from UCR data, and from other stuff. And so here's been the trend on violent deaths in school. And so these are deaths that would include homicide and suicide up here. Down here is suicide. Here is the homicide. And so, as you can see, for the years this data was measured, it sort of varies in a small bandwidth between 34 of a high and 17 as a low. And on the one hand, homicides within a school, any of them are horrible and tragic. On the other hand, you have to think about, again, there's 15, 16,000 homicides that happen in any given year. So when you say 14 of the 16,000 happened in school, you got to recognize what a very, very small fraction of homicides that is. And so overall, schools tend to be very, very safe places. And that's in terms of homicide, it's in terms of violent victimization as well. So these are the rates per thousand students of violence, both away from school and at school. These are all violent victimizations, and these are serious violent victimizations. And again, there's always two ways to look at the data. And so I do remember when this happened, when these lines crossed, the common sense, the criminology advice was, look, your kids are safer at school than they are not in school, because most victimizations happen, or more likely to get victimized away from school. When these lines crossed, the sort of media take on it was, oh my God, kids are no longer safer at school as they are on the outside. Which technically is true, but it's not because school violence got worse. It's because away from school, not school violence, followed the same trend as everything else, got a lot better. That crime sort of fell everywhere, and that it just didn't fall as fast in school as it did out of school. So if you look at those trends, there's nothing in here to suggest that crime is getting worse in school. And it's true for any violent victimization. It's true for serious violent victimizations. All right, so moving away from homicide, the next crime we're going to talk about is rape and sexual assault. So rape, by definition, is unlawful sexual intercourse by force or without consent. We've had, and there are some variations in these definitions based on jurisdiction. There's been a debate on force and what counts as force and whether force is needed to show rape. There's issues. So the UCR, I don't know how many caught this, but there's a sort of legacy definition and a new definition in the UCR data for rape. And the issue was that some jurisdictions defined rape, the stock definition was carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. Some jurisdictions interpret this as excluding things like forced oral sex or forced anal sex because it wasn't vaginal sex. And so the new definition is very explicit in terms of how it defines it. So literally it's the penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus or with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. So where we still debate in terms of different jurisdictions is whether you have this part about legal or factual consent. In some states that's left out, some states still have it. There's other debates kind of along the edge of the law. One of the issues, for example, is what happens in so-called initial consent cases. So two people initially, both consenting folks, but one of them, somewhere after the sexual activity starts, withdraws their consent and says, no, stop, I don't want to do this, and the other person refuses to stop. And there's some legal debate about whether that can be rape or not, or how to define that. there's other areas we'll talk about in a bit as well. So the key to sort of rape definitions is that there is sexual penetration. Sexual assault is defined as forced or coerced sexual intimacy short of rape. So unwanted touching, groping, those sorts of things. Rape is, and a lot of you picked up on this early in the semester when we looked at data, is one of the more underreported crimes that we have. That happens for a variety of reasons. Victims feel ashamed. Victims are fearful. Victims don't think anything can be done or that the perpetrator is going to be caught. There's a variety of reasons why folks don't report. Reporting is also sort of related to the type of sexual assault or rape that happens. Stranger rapes, for example, are much more likely to be reported than rapes that occur amongst acquaintances. Our estimates for how much rape and sexual assault happen are very much related to sort of the definitions and type. So the numbers are going to be a lot higher if instead of force we also include sort of coercion, and they're going to be a lot higher if we include sexual assault and rape together, and if you include attempted versus completed rapes. So the numbers kind of are all over the place, but they're all over the place for a variety of those reasons. That are we talking about just rape? We're talking about rape and sexual assault. Are we talking about a completed and attempted, or just completed? And so, if you look at the rape rate in the U.S., it is 63 per 100,000. Again, this is going to be a vast underestimate of how much happens. But if you think of it, just as a starting point in terms of comparing rape to something like homicide, right? A homicide rate is the rape rate is 10 to 15 times higher than the homicide rate, and it's likely much higher than that because homicides are more likely to get reported than our rapes. Aside from UCR, so our better data is going to come from victimization surveys. So unsurprisingly, they suggest that estimates are a lot higher. So the one that a lot of folks rely on, the National Violence Against Women survey, one of our better surveys, found that 18% of women and 3% of men experienced either an attempted or completed rape over their lifetime. At colleges and universities, so some of my friends were doing some of the pioneering work on this at the University of Cincinnati 15, 20 years ago. What they found, and again, it's very startling, upwards of a quarter of women over a 4-year college career experience an attempted or completed rape. So the numbers can be very high, again, kind of depending upon how you think about it. But regardless of how you think about it, 20-25% is a pretty startling figure. As with other violent crime, rape is most likely to be perpetrated by non-strangers, by acquaintances, by friends, by somebody you know, by spouses. And so it brings up the issue of date rape, which is a term that sort of came out of my, when I was a teenager was the first time I remember people talking about this. And it's happened since, probably since people have existed. But we've started talking about it really in the 1980s and talking about how it is a sort of real crime, that you have the fact that it occurs in the context of dating and sort of legitimate interaction doesn't make it less important or less of a crime. And it is, in terms of the type of rapes that exist, one of the most underreported forms of rape. Now we can skip the date rape drugs stuff. Except that we talked about this last time in the face-to-face class. I can't remember what it was. That somebody made some company designed what was it? It was a lipstick. It was a fingernail polish. It was something that turned the color if your drink had been tainted by one of the date rape drugs, which I thought was an absolute sort of genius situational crime prevention method. One stuff from date rape, if you think about marital rape, if date rape kind of, in terms of how we talked about it and how we thought about it in society, changed in the 1980s, marital rape has changed only really recently. Um, in fact, um, many states didn't change their law until the last 10, 15 years, and that English common law, uh, under English common law, marital rape was not possible because English common law basically said when a woman said "I do" and got married, she basically said, um, "My husband now has the right to my body whenever they want." And so, because of that English common law, the logic is that it would be impossible to rape somebody's spouse because she already consented basically for her life. Um, so more recently, state laws have changed. As you might suspect, it is one of the most underreported forms of rape out there. Spouses don't interpret it as rape. Even if they do, they don't want to report their own spouse. So it's hard to even get a good estimate of how much of this is going on. But estimates vary from a low of 8 to a high of 23% in terms of if you think about what percent of spouses report getting raped by their spouse. Um, One thing we know for sure is that there's an extraordinarily strong relationship between battering and marital rape. So the vast majority of marital rapes occur in the context of a violent battering relationship between spouses. In terms of our explanations of rape and sexual assault, one of the big sort of debates is what's the motivation? Is the motivation sexual gratification? Is it simply another form of violence and using sex as a weapon? And is it sort of more abstractly a sort of form of male dominance over females in terms of politics, in terms of culture? Um, and more of the answer, I think, has been, even amongst sort of the more feminist orientated chronologists, has been it depends. That, if you think about a date rape that happens between 16, 17-year-old kids, it may be conceivable that the motivation is sex, that the person just doesn't take no for an answer, but the goal is not violence, the goal is not dominance, the goal is sex. Whereas if you think about rape in the context of wars, and rape used to sort of dominate and shame other folks, that definitely there's a lot of rapes that are political and cultural in their nature. And if you think about rape in the context of battering and other forms of violence, that there's a lot of rapes that are violent by their nature and violent in their goal. And so criminologists have thought a lot about this over the past 20, 25 years. And again, I think the consensus is that the answer is, well, it depends on the particular case. Um, in terms of how we explain rape and theories, um, different folks have taken different positions. What I put on this slide is kind of the sort of key concepts that people have used from different theories. One is patriarchy. So patriarchy refers to a male-dominated society, and the idea is that if you have males controlling and dominating a society and controlling women, that rape is used as a way to control women. And there is some evidence, and if you look at the society-level studies, that in less patriarchal societies, you have a lot less rape. In more patriarchal societies, you have more rape. Um, Another central concept is this idea of rape myths or attitudes about women and rape. So the idea that when a woman says no, she really means yes, or that women secretly desire to be raped, or that women who dress seductively deserve to be raped. These are all sort of attitudes and values that promote rape or that lessen the shame associated with engaging in rape. And like other sort of thoughts and cognition, one of the things they do is they lessen the guilt and stigma associated with that particular crime. Um, One of the other sort of key components has been this idea of masculine sex role socialization. So how do we socialize males in the country? And to the extent that males are socialized to be sort of aggressive and non-empathetic and cold and calculating, that you are sort of supporting sexual aggression and rape. So when we treat women as just um, pieces of property, uh, that we don't sort of emphasize relationship and love and caring about other people and those sorts of things. And when we socialize males, we sort of frame that stuff as wimpy, wussy stuff. Um, you should expect in that context more sexual aggression. And finally, at sort of an individual level, you look at sort of why some individuals are willing to engage in crime to meet sexual needs. That part of it may be a lack of skills to express their sexuality in a pro-social way, an appropriate way. One of the areas that's been studied over and over again, and I mean, there's reason to believe that pornography might relate to that. If you look at pornography, researchers have studied content that it reinforces a lot of rape myths. It portrays women as sexual objects and so on and so forth. There'd be a lot of reason to suspect that pornography is related to rape and sexual assault. Scientifically, there's not a lot of evidence that is true. Um, so these are sort of the key concepts that have been used in a variety of theories. In terms of which are supported the most, I would say attitudes towards rape and sexual assault in women, socialization are the two big ones that have been sort of confirmed over and over in research that relate to rape and sexual assault. In terms of what we do with people who engage in these crimes, we've tried a variety of things in terms of rehabilitation. I think one of the myths is that sex offenders are untreatable. You hear that over and over, like, oh, they're a sex offender and they're a pedophile and they can't be cured. The evidence is that good correctional interventions reduce sexual offending at about the same level as they do other forms of offending. What we've done, actual castration, so cutting off the private parts of the man, actually turns out to be a fairly effective form of intervention, but not perfect. That there are people that get castrated that do engage in sexual offenses later on. Not a lot of them, but it's one of the things people look at and say, well, it has to be more, rape has to be about more than sexual gratification if they no longer have the parts and they still engage in sexual offenses. Chemical castration is essentially shooting them up with hormones to kill the sex drive, and that works about as well as sort of our best programming over here. And so we treat sex offenders the same way we treat everybody else. So one of the things you do is you eliminate those attitudes that support rape and sexual assault. The other thing you do is you teach skills. You think of empathy, right? If you are thinking about how other people feel and understand how they feel, it gets a lot harder to engage in a crime like sexual assault or rape. And so the same cognitive skills we teach offenders are the ones we also work on with sex offenders. It is a complicated literature because one of the issues is sex offending is a lot harder to detect in a lot of cases than other offending because it gets underreported. And it's especially true if it's children. If we're talking about pedophiles, that it's a very hard crime to detect. And so we're always a bit leery about how well our treatments work. All right, so the third offense is we're going to talk about is robbery. Robbery is taking somebody's property by force or threat of force. Give me your shoes or I'm going to kick your ass. That's different, again, from burglary, which is breaking into somebody's house, usually when they're not there to take their stuff. Like other crimes, robbery's been on the decline. Robbery makes up a good chunk of serious violent crimes, 30%. It's a crime like rape and sexual assault and homicide that a lot of Americans fear. You think about walking down the street and getting mugged, which is mugged is slang for being robbed, that somebody pulls a knife or a gun on you and demands your wallet. It's a crime that scares a lot of people, and so it's one that people take pretty seriously. What do we know about robbery? The vast majority of robberies, and this is one thing that makes robbery different from other violent crime. Robberies tend to be perpetrated by strangers, whereas other violent crime and other crime generally tends to be perpetrated by people we know. It's more likely to involve multiple offenders. it's more likely to be an interracial crime. So somebody of one race robbing somebody of a different race. The majority of robbers are young, tend to be more African American and male. And again, where robberies occur, you think muggings, a lot of them are in street and in residents and stores. Um, some of these residents are what folks would call home invasion. Some of them you start as a burglary. You're just trying to break into somebody's house. You think they're not home, but they're awake. And now what was a burglary, if you continue the crime and not run away, turns into a robbery because you're taking their stuff by force. Um, Explaining robbery, like, unlike rape, the motivation seems pretty simple on the surface, that you're robbing somebody to get their money, which in the vast majority of cases is true. But research in the last 20 years has found that there's a variety of kind of secondary motivations, that a lot of robberies are done, especially in certain neighborhoods, to kind of maintain a street reputation as a badass, that you're willing to rob people. Part of it is psychological thrill. If you interview robbers, they say, you know what, it's a charge to sort of put a gun in somebody's face and demand stuff, and they have to follow. And a lot of these folks are folks that are not used to being sort of in the driver's seat and being able to demand and have people listen to them. And so um, it can also be used for intimidation and revenge, and that goes back to, you think of, like, how do you rob somebody that's not a stranger? Like, if they know you and you rob them, doesn't seem very smart. But a lot of it's done for sort of revenge or intimidation rather than the actual property or money that you get from the robbery. Um, uh, some people compare robbery to burglary and think about, how rational it is. And one of the issues with robbery is that it tends to happen. It can happen a little more spur of the moment. Um, you get you get sort of more cash, less middlemen than a burglary. If you think about a burglary and you take a TV and a computer, you still have to turn that around and get money. Whereas in robbery, most of what's taken is cash. Um, One of the issues with robbery is, in terms of rationality, is that robbers do tend to prey on vulnerable victims. And so, somebody staggering down the street, for example, is much more prone to getting robbed than if there's five people moving down the street in a pack together who aren't inebriated. One of the best examples of vulnerable victims in robbery is that the people most likely to get robbed are people who are engaging in crime themselves. They are vulnerable because they can't go to the police, right? So if you're dealing weed and somebody breaks into your house and puts a gun to your face and takes all your weed, can you really call the cops and say, yeah, I just had my home invaded and somebody robbed me and they stole all my weed? Um, Same issue for those. If you think about prostitutes, somebody who robs a prostitute, they're vulnerable because they can't really report the robbery. Um, and so, because they were engaging in crime themselves. And so people in both cases, right, these are people who are vulnerable because they can't report, and vulnerable because they're dealing in cash, right? They have a lot of cash on hand, or product if you're engaging in sale of illicit drugs. So, best advice for not being robbed is then to not engage in crime yourself. Um, there's also, in terms of sort of, to the extent crime is rational, there's some things people can do in terms of target hardening, that if you're going to travel in groups. Don't flash money around in public places. Don't engage in crime yourself, and so on and so forth. So, to some extent, it is a preventable crime if you think about it that way. All right, the last violent crime is assault. There are two forms of assault. Aggravated assault is one of the Part 1 violent crimes in UCR data, and that's if you attack somebody and inflict injury on them, and if it involves a weapon. So either if you hurt somebody basically bad enough to go to hospital, or you hurt somebody with a weapon, it tends to be aggravated assault. Simple assault doesn't involve a weapon and doesn't involve serious injury. So a bar fight where you take a swipe at somebody and maybe pop them, but don't break their jaw or don't do anything serious, and it ends quickly. would be an example of simple assault. A bar fight that rages on where people send each other to the hospital would be an example of aggravated assault. Assaults make up the vast majority of violent crime reported to the police because it tends to be a fairly common crime. Despite that, the vast majority of assaults are not reported. And there's a variety of reasons, but some assaults involve a family member. People are afraid of reprisal. But one of the big reasons is people don't view it as a sort of crime worth reporting. They view it as a private matter. They got in a fight. They got in a scuffle. Why would I call the police? And so if you think about that bar fight, people take a few swings, somebody hits somebody else, or a fight that breaks out of the party where nobody gets hurt. It's not really surprising that people aren't going to report it to the police. Also not surprising, who assaults each other? It tends to be overwhelmingly young males. In fact, people who study homicide and people who study assault basically say the same thing, that homicides, when you look at their nature and their characteristics, tend to essentially be assaults that turn lethal. That is, they start the same way. They start as arguments, as fights. Homicides tend to sort of flow from that. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. I'm not going to go into all kinds of detail here, except to say that you can think of violence and explaining violence at multiple levels. That at a country level, when you think about homicide in the U.S., we have a lot of inequality. You can think of it in terms of enemy theory, but again, the limit there is that almost all the analyses are on homicide rather than violence generally. At the neighborhood level, if you think about social disorganization theory, that's one of the most it's one of the theories that's generated the most empirical support, that in neighborhoods that lack collective efficacy and that have those ecological characteristics, that they're sort of run down, they're mixed use, they are people move in and out of, there's more empowerment than ownership. They're the sorts of neighborhoods where you see the most of the serious violent crime. And at the individual level, you can think about, why do some people hurt each other and kill each other? Damn near everything we've talked about in terms of theory relates to that. You can think of parenting, you can think of media exposure, you can think of delinquent peers. But when you do that, one of the things I encourage you to also think of is that we've had this huge decline in violence. And so in this long laundry list of stuff you're thinking about, have any of these things gotten better? Are we better at parenting? Is there less violence in the media? And so on and so forth. So again, a very interesting puzzle about what we think causes crime and violence, and maybe why things have gotten better or crime's gone down. All right, I think that's well more than enough for violence.